So thanks so much to everyone for joining. Welcome to the second installment of SUSE's academic series. Today, we are very lucky to be hearing from Dr. Aaron Opdyke, who is a senior lecturer in humanitarian engineering here at the University of Sydney. Aaron's research focuses on global disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation efforts, with a focus on safe and equitable housing. We are so lucky to be hearing from Aaron today, and the key topic of discussion is going to surround Aaron's research and fieldwork experience. So thank you so much for joining the session, Aaron. We really appreciate it. I'll pass it on to you from here.
Great. Thanks, Grace. So as Grace mentioned, I think that's a wonderful and a very generous introduction. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my research and kind of what I do. But I realize it is 5 p.m. on a Thursday, so I'll try to keep it a little bit lively and stick to just some stories and images kind of over my career experience. And so Grace had asked me to open and talk a little bit about how I sort of ended up where I am today. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit further about some of the research that I'm doing and kind of what that looks like overseas at the moment. So I'd like to just begin by acknowledging that today I'm joining on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Obviously, you might be joining elsewhere today, so I'd like to also acknowledge the lands of other peoples that you may be joining us on today. So a little bit about my career. So as I mentioned, I'll just talk a little bit about kind of how I ended up where I am. I actually started out working at a number of different organizations, both on the government side as well as in practice, really on large infrastructure projects. And so that's quite different than a lot of the work that I'm doing now. But so the very first job that I actually started on was actually on Seven Oaks Dam. So at the moment, this is among the top 10 largest earthen dams in the world. And so it was really sort of just as an intern, kind of getting my feet wet in operations. So this wasn't necessarily on the construction side, but the dam had just finished construction. But really seeing the scale of a project of this size was just really impressive. And I think that's really what got me linked into engineering. And I was always so passionate about it. I think being able to see what we're actually building and then kind of see the scale of that type of construction happening. So this work was with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So it's a branch of the United States government. So it's not actually a military division, but they actually focus and manage all of the floodplain management in the United States. And so it was a really unique opportunity, and I had the opportunity to work on a couple different projects actually with them. So another dam project that I had the chance to work on, so Crowder Dam, and so this kind of sits as you move into Los Angeles. It's one of the key flood city of Los Angeles in the United States. And so it was really interesting kind of, again, being out in the field every day. And so it was field-based. It wasn't necessarily in an office. So, half of my day I'd be out in the field. And I think early on in my career, that's something that I was always quite passionate about. And I think I was quite blessed to have that opportunity. So through this opportunity, I just long days in the field, I think I kind of started to understand a little bit about how we go from thinking about designs on paper and then how that translates in some of the issues or dilemmas that might emerge. And so I'll come back to that, but I think that's really been the theme in my career in entering into research, but then also some of the work that I'm now doing today is really some of the dilemmas we face when we go from trying to design things on paper or digitally and then try to transfer that into something that actually gets constructed. So I also had a chance to work with them on a variety of different projects. So this one, just another example, was a hospital. So this was an upgrade and a retrofit for Veterans Affairs. So this was for veterans that had returned and providing them healthcare services. And it was really the first chance in my career that I had the opportunity to actually take on some small design projects. And so as part of this, I was talking with Grace actually earlier this week. And I think early on in my career, what I learned through those field experiences is really about the importance of engaging with people. So we'll come back to that and how that sort of interacts with what fieldwork is and why that's so important for us as engineers. But I was tasked with basically coming up with a design for a containment area for sort of the waste for the hospital. And quite basic, really. It was really just, some bumps on the ground, really, in the concrete. So, they trusted the intern to do that. But I didn't bother actually going out and talking to somebody. And so I'll never forget the moment where they went to place these bins in place and, they didn't fit into what I had actually tried to design and how the users were actually sort of interacting with those waste systems. And so I think that was a light bulb moment for me in realizing the importance of talking to people as part of that design process. We can't design just behind desks. We need to go out, we need to understand who's actually using the infrastructure. or the services or things that we're designing as engineers. And so, again, we'll talk more about how that's kind of shaped my career in different ways. But I think just kind of one anecdote to kind of start kind of where I begun my career. I then had the chance to work on a couple other large infrastructure projects in construction. And so sort of this hybrid between the builder and then the designer. So a lot of the work that I was doing was actually focused on temporary structure design. So an example of that, so this is a project that I worked on in Los Angeles. So this was about a 10-mile stretch, so a couple kilometer stretch, where they were widening for high occupancy vehicles. So adding a couple additional lanes to this, as well as an extensive array of different bridge infrastructure that was going in. And so I was responsible for designing the temporary structures that would hold up things until we could actually pour that concrete. And so it was a great experience, sort of blending that design experience, but then also being out in the field every day to really see, who had to actually build this. So somebody had come up with this great idea. They'd thought through that, but then the practicalities of seeing that constructed are often very different. And so I think I learned a lot through that experience. Again, just interacting with people. And so, as I came back and did more design a little bit later on in my career, I think that was quite beneficial in seeing sort of a builder's perspective and understanding the constraints that they're often faced with. Also had a chance to work on some similar road infrastructure. So this was another project just going on to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco for a different company, so Flatiron, but they're also a builder doing similar things. So on that was really looking at temporary structure design, trying to translate that design and then put it into practice in the field. And then kind of came back after that to the former company that I worked for and had a chance to work in Hawaii for a while. Again, doing similar things. So these are some of the images if you look at the bottom. So this is actually a light rail system that they're building sort of around Pearl Harbor on Oahu, which is the main island in Hawaii. And so you can see some images kind of showing those tracks and the guideways that were going in place on the bottom, and then the train that's now sort of up and running for a couple segments of this. But it was multi-year project, billions of dollars invested in this. But again, really important. And I think what was unique about this project was also about that importance of engaging with communities. And so as part of this, actually, there was a find of remains on the site. And so that actually ended up shutting down the project for an entire year. And so really thinking through and understanding the cultural aspects of the communities that we're designing and where our infrastructure is actually going through. So I think equivalents of that here in Australia is obviously the importance of thinking about engaging with traditional owners, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. And we don't have to go far to think about that. So Redfern, just a couple meters really from where our building is in civil engineering, has a strong Aboriginal roots in its community there. But so as I was kind of going through this, and these were, I think, quite intellectually and technically challenging projects that I had the opportunity to work on. But concurrent to this, a lot of the work I was also doing kind of on a pro bono basis and volunteering, particularly internationally. It really got me thinking about that. Most of what we try to design is really for 10% of the world's population. And so I think Paul Pollock sort of has said this nicely. And so this was a term that was sort of coined in the 90s, design for the other 90% is something that we don't often think about. And so the way in which we try to approach that, and so my work in humanitarian engineering really tries to take this to heart, to think about how that design process is different, how those constraints are different, and how to engage with communities that are marginalized. And so a lot of the work that I do intersects with disasters and climate change, and which has a particularly strong impact on those types of communities globally. And so, some of the experiences that I had that kind of got my foot in the door to this, I had done quite a bit of work in India. So this is a small community that we're working on a sanitation program. So about half of this particular community did not have access to latrines or toilets. So it was open defecation for most of the community. And so our organization was helping them kind of build the infrastructure and look through what that might look like. And so during this process, like I said, some of the work that I had to do in India, it also posed, I think, some key questions sort of emerged out of this. So some of the images on the left are some the sanitation infrastructure that we were building as part of this. So the top left, you can actually see some of the community engagement that we were doing, trying to look and educate the community on the importance. So what you're actually seeing there is fecal coliform tests. So those are actually showing basically and looking at the presence of E. coli in their water. And so we were doing some testing on that to look at the different transmission pathways that were existing around those sanitation practices. But this resulted in a couple different projects. So the first of these was household level sort of septic tanks or latrines really. And so this was quite successful. And so a lot of these got built in that community. But then in the later stages of that, as things started to move and the community was interested in more centralized and much larger systems, after I had sort of left, but sort of on the tail end of that, the community and that engagement piece actually started to fall apart. And so this project actually was really a complete failure on the later stages of it. So the first part of that, the household level, was quite successful, but it really started to get me think about not just the technical aspects. So again, the solutions that we were designing, they were quite technically sound, but really the reason for that failure was the lack of that engagement. And so there was a lot of questions I think that I was left with after that experience about, why do these types of projects, particularly where international organizations are coming in and trying to work on basic infrastructure development solutions, why do they fail? And so this was really a pivot and a transition point, I'd say, in my career in thinking about research, really taking an opportunity to reflect and investigate and explore those questions. And so, a lot of colleagues that I worked with, they often had questions that they would want answered. And so I think that the ability for research to connect and answer those questions and really have an ability to step beyond one project is something that really sort of changed my career direction at that point in time. But then, so also concurrent to this, I think what I started to see, and as Grace sort of mentioned at the start, and I would mention a lot of my work does focus on disasters and climate change. But I also was sort of in the midst of a couple earthquakes. And so growing up in California in the United States, which is a seismic region, I'd always been exposed to earthquakes, but we didn't necessarily have high losses. And so that was because our infrastructure was designed for that. But being in India, I got to see sort of firsthand, and actually being in a couple large earthquakes. So the images on the right are from a northern state of Sikkim, which kind of borders up near Nepal and Bangladesh. This is a building basically that had fallen off the hillside. And so actually seeing that and being in the midst of that really got me thinking about, the role that engineers have to play in reducing these risks. And so I think those experiences were sort of pivotal in shaping kind of where I've ended up today. And then this kind of led me into a couple future opportunities. So this is sort of after that, this is some work that I did in the Philippines. And so in 2013, Typhoon Haiyan, so at the time it was the strongest typhoon to ever make landfall. So I was deployed as part of a nonprofit organization working on housing programs and assisting communities rebuild. But you can just see the level of devastation that was inflicted after this. And a lot of that just has to do with, the lack or the quality of infrastructure that existed there. And so just complete devastation. You can see both from storm surge as well as the winds. So the winds in this particular area were in excess and over 315 kilometers per hour. And so, you can imagine just how devastating that is for an area where their infrastructure just can't cope with that. And so as part of that, it sort of got me in a lot of the work that I currently do now focuses on housing. And so I had the chance to work in practice. So this is kind of showing some of the houses that were going up as part of that program that we were helping households rebuild. So there was about 2,000 homes that we were assisting to rebuild in this process. And so again, the ability to really engage with communities was a key part of that. And so again, the fieldwork elements, so being out in the field and engaging was quite pivotal, I think, in that. And there's a lot of lessons I think that I drew out of that particular experience. And again, I've continued kind of this trend working in the Philippines. So this is where a lot of my work is based, as well as across Southeast Asia. So I'm currently doing, and I'll touch maybe at the end about some of the other places I'm working at the moment. But then also had the opportunity to go back and actually be based on the government side through a foreign assistance program. So this was some of the work that I was doing actually in a local government disaster risk reduction and management office, and really trying to help them and look at ways that they could reduce those risks. So this was actually a field assessment that we were doing just after some flooding, trying to assess infrastructure and along sort of a riverbank and erosion that had happened after that, and doing some assessments. But again, quite important, I think, and just one way that we often see engineers might be deployed in the aftermath of a disaster. And so that's quite similar here. And there's different ways that we might come back to at the end of today's discussion about how you might become involved as those crises emerge, because engineers do have a very important role to play in that process. And then that kind of led me into my PhD research. And so a lot of that focused in the Philippines. And so just kind of some stories from this, you can take a look at some of these images. So this was, again, just showing some of the devastation after the typhoon that I had the opportunity to work on sort of in the practice, or actually for an organization implementing. But then I spent about 4 years actually looking at, well, what did organizations do and what was working? And a lot of that really came back to that communities, there was different levels of recovery, organizations, and this is a reoccurring question, I would say, for organizations that respond to these crises, is that they need evidence to support how to respond better. And so I think on the research side, that was something that really hooked me into it, was thinking about, the ability to have impact beyond just one project. So, a lot of engineers, they might talk about over their entire career that they work on a handful of projects. And that's, you have the ability to really sort of take a deep dive into that. But then having and thinking about the impact you can have much broader beyond that. So again, these are persistent issues that every organization, every practitioner is facing. And so I think the ability of research to answer those questions so that we can implement better projects is quite powerful. So again, this is just some of the images of the programs that we were looking at. And again, most of these were focused on housing in different ways in the Philippines in this particular research. So kind of reflecting on, what is fieldwork, and I think this can look very different for different disciplines of engineering. So if you're a geotechnical engineer and you're on site versus a structural engineer, but I'd say that to some extent, I think fieldwork is quite important for all types of civil engineers. And so a couple of reflections that I was thinking about, before today's talk. So my research and what fieldwork, looks like to me might be a little bit different than it might look like in your career. So if you're Sydney based, but certainly I think I would hope that you have the opportunity, or you should be asking to engage in that at some point. But I think it's anything that gets you outside the office. And so there's sort of two takeaways I think that are important to consider why fieldwork is an important part of our role as engineers. And the first of these is that designs don't always shape up in real life. So kind of going back to my example early in my career and looking at, not talking to people, I didn't ask the end users what they needed. And so, that's quite important to think about how are people going to use the infrastructure that we're designing and the services that we're designing. And that needs to accommodate to their needs. But then also somebody has to build that. And so I think our role as engineers is also to communicate those designs. And so that requires, some of that might come through written documentation, but there is a strong component that involves getting out and actually talking to the people. So I don't think there's any substitute for being out on a construction site and actually seeing something be built and talking to the people and the dilemmas or the problems that they're facing as they're going through with that. And that's important to ensure that, the designs that we're coming up with, that they're safe and it's getting built in a way that is intended. But then also on the flip side of that, I think this is probably an even more important takeaway is that, we're not just building infrastructure for the sake of building infrastructure. We're building it for people to use. And so I think we need to engage with, those people to understand what do they need? How are they going to access it and use it? And so I think this has been a big theme in a lot of the current research that I'm doing is really trying to engage with those end users to understand, what are their needs? How can we better engage them in that construction and that design process? So a couple examples. So I think before today's talk, I was asked to maybe highlight just one of these and kind of what this has looked like in some current work that I'm doing. And so this has actually been a partnership with one particular local government that we've been doing some work with for about 5 or 6 years now in the Philippines. And it's really trying to look at, increasing their resources and planning for infrastructure and looking at the ways that they can reduce that risk in their infrastructure. And so this was a project that we initially, when we started, was actually looking at just trying to create digital information around base maps. So, things that we completely take for granted here in Sydney is, your ability to go onto Google Maps and look up a map. That just didn't even exist. And so we talk about spatial aspects of planning and then, where and how we're building our infrastructure. That was sort of a prerequisite step for this. And the only way that we could really do that was to actually engage with communities. And so, what we're seeing here is that these community members are actually sort of mapping that out. So they are digitizing that process by hand. That's kind of going into a GIS model that we were working on, and also making that open source. So that communities themselves could sort of interact and see that information. So, just a couple of their images kind of showing what this looks like. And so this was kind of that first step in that process. And then what that eventually led to, and this is some ongoing work that we're doing, is actually trying to then use that and engage with community members to understand, well, how do they understand particular hazards or risks? So kind of just picking apart one of these, and an example of this for today's talk, this is looking at flood exposure. And so what we were able to do with this is actually compare and look at, well, how do communities understand flood risk in their, in their areas? And then how does that compare to what we might traditionally model as engineers? And so the right side of this is showing those more probabilistic models that were actually developed, but there's a lot of, gaps in that. And so some of that comes in the context that we're working in for this particular work. And I'd say in lower income countries, we don't always have access to, the same level of base information. So examples of that would be, high quality resolution of digital elevation model. Don't necessarily have that. So I'll just ask, I think if anyone's talking, if you just go on mute, that'd be great. And so you can see quite stark differences.
My God, for a second, I thought my volume was on, like freaking out.
So on the left, what you're seeing is that community map. And so these are looking at sort of high, medium, and then low flood exposure areas. And on the right side are those more scientifically derived models. And so I think this ability to engage with communities is quite important. And I think that there's some unique opportunities, not just around just the engagement or just the scientific or traditional engineering models, but how do we actually hybridize that for better infrastructure planning and outcomes? And so that's really been where some of our work has come from this. So talking about some of the outcomes. So one example of this has been actually using that information for evacuation planning. So these are households that are sort of plotting out, where people are going to go in the event of a flood. And so looking at trying to reduce, the burden sort of in the immediate aftermath of the flood and then preparation for that. But then also, as I mentioned, I think that connection between local knowledge. So how do we take this knowledge that's quite rich at a community level, but then also that engineering knowledge, that technical side where we can really develop and start to look at much more quantitatively the planning process. And so ways in which we've been doing this, particularly using new technology and creating digital twins. So on the left, I'll kind of just show you a snippet and kind of let this run, but this is actually just from last year, where we're actually using drones to actually create these elevation models. So as I mentioned, one of the things that was really missing in the early stages of this is that we didn't have the ability to even have high quality elevation data. And so that's changing as technology also evolves. So utilizing this in combination with those community perspectives is often quite powerful. And so on the right, kind of some of the outcomes that you're seeing from that is actually risk maps. And so these are what we're working with the local government in this case, is trying to map at a building level, where are vulnerable structures. And so kind of for different scenarios, so those are showing sort of 4 different storm surge scenarios for this particular one. So coastal flooding, about, where would households be most affected. So where's the infrastructure that they need to focus on and think about maybe upgrading or retrofitting, or thinking about evacuating those households. So I think kind of neat. And this has been quite exciting seeing that intersection between these different perspectives. So again, just another example of kind of what fieldwork can look like. And I think increasingly we're using digital tools in order to aid us in fieldwork. So whether that's on a construction site or in different ways, it's becoming quite important, I would say, in terms of how we work as engineers. So some takeaways, I guess, from that. And then, like I said, I promised to keep it short and sweet today and hopefully turn it into more of a discussion. But I think fieldwork really enables you to revisit your assumptions. And so I think before you rush and come up with a design, the ability to actually go out onto a site, talk to someone who's building it, talk to an end user, it allows you to revisit, what were the assumptions that I had made at the start. And I think that's a really important process. I think every time I engage in fieldwork again, there's new things that I'm learning as part of that process. And so I think ensuring that you're not just stuck behind a desk, is that you are talking to those people as part of that process. I think is a vitally important part about any infrastructure that we're designing. But then really the second one is also recognizing that people are the agents of change. And so I think as engineers, we often think about the infrastructure that we're building, but we often don't necessarily think about how we engage people in that process, or how are we building the capacity of, say, builders or different construction firms to actually deliver those services in a better way. And so I think at the end of the day, we can sit behind a desk and come up with great ideas, but unless someone goes out and actually constructs it, that reality doesn't come about. And so I think it's really recognizing the value of people in that engineering process. So just a couple other examples, I think, to kind of wrap up and tie in what this looks like even here within our own school. So these are actually just a couple snapshots or images of different students that I've worked with. And so some of these are actually for honors projects. Some of them are for higher degrees by research. I think SUSE has run a couple other sessions looking at, what does a PhD actually look like, or what that next step might look like if that's something that you're interested in. So these are kind of some examples of that. So on the top left, these were 2 students that I was working with, Shireen and Luke, and so they had worked on this, looking at actually mapping some of the drainage infrastructure in the community that I was talking about. The top right, so this is Isaac, a master's student that I have, and generously and spent the time actually putting together that video today from some of the field work that we did last year. So this is actually out in the field doing a survey. So if you are wondering, do those surveying skills that you took in your first year, do they ever come into practice? I'd say the resounding answer is yes, if you ever find yourself out on a construction site. And I think that those skills are quite important. And then the bottom left, so this was Nanako, so another honor student that I had last year that was doing some field work, interviews and focus groups with communities in Japan. So this was after the about 10 years in the aftermath of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and looking at sort of those recovery processes. And so again, talking to those people about their experiences. and then consulting with end users to see, did that infrastructure actually result in better outcomes or not. And then on the bottom, so a little bit more recently, Grace, who introduced me today, as well as Zoe, are two current honor students that I'm working with for their thesis. So this is just a snapshot actually from a consultation that they were doing with a local farming cooperative, looking at sort of how they're involved in that planning process for climate change adaptation in the Philippines. So again, just a couple different ways of what this looks like. But like I said, I think we have plenty of time and more than enough. And I hope that we can turn it into a little bit of a discussion or questions that you might have about what fieldwork looks like for you, or how to get involved in these types of opportunities. So with that, I'll open it up and see if there's any questions.
If anybody had any questions or wanted to bring something to the discussion, they could turn on their camera and feel free to ask Aaron anything. I don't know, I could kick us off if that breaks the ice. Aaron, and thank you again for that discussion. It was really cool to hear about your career progression and to see, especially someone like me who's finishing up this year, the different pathways that are possible after engineering or after completing our degree. But my question was kind of looking at, you talked a lot about the importance of engaging with end users, but as someone who hasn't had a lot of fieldwork experience before, apart from what you just discussed at the end, are there any techniques that come to mind for you that you've employed that really help you in your investigation of the best way to approach an end user or engaging with end users?
Yeah, I think it probably looks a little bit different depending on what type of role that you're in. So if you're working for a big engineering firm, there's probably a whole team that focuses on community consultations. But I think where you as an engineer are in those situations, I think sort of checking your assumptions at the door. And so I think, an approach that I would often take when I enter into an interview is not necessarily trying to impose what I think, is just asking and sort of from a user's perspective, what are the challenges that they're facing? I think that, again, putting those assumptions aside when you enter into a consultation or a conversation with an end user is quite important, because I think that the answers that you get might surprise you. I think frequently a lot of the work that I do, that ends up happening. So even if you think you already know the answer to that, asking it in a little bit more of an open-ended way, but then also just spending the time to get to know who your end user is. And so I think that, often a one-off consultation is not necessarily going to do it. And so if you're working on a project, for example, in a new area, geographic area, spending a little bit of time to understand what is the culture, even if that's in Australia, it doesn't have to be an international project. But if you're working in a different suburb in Sydney, how do those end users see, or what are what's their value system? And so understanding that, I think, can really help you connect across issues that they might be facing or needs that they have that you might not necessarily be expecting when you come into that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. Does anybody else have any questions for Aaron? I can offer extra pep points if you ask. Maybe another question in the meantime, while everyone's thinking really hard, is do you have any ideas about next steps that you want to take in your career? Are you interested more to keep going down the humanitarian engineering side, or do you see yourself possibly going back to where you started looking at big infrastructure projects?
I think a little bit of both. So I think like I said, the real benefit, I think, of working on the research side is that it's quite flexible in terms of how and where you spend your time. And so I think as an academic, I get to sort of choose where and what I focus on. And so I think there is an appeal, I think, towards working towards, larger infrastructure projects often can have a scalable impact on communities. So there's big money involved in it. There's lots of resources to get thrown behind them. So like I said, a lot of the work that I do now is really focused on, I wouldn't say smaller, but I'd say at sort of a household level intervention. So whether that's looking at sanitation infrastructure or, housing, like that's something that's often very individualistic. So it's not necessarily a road or, a dam, kind of where I started my career. So I think there's definitely, I think I'd be interested in kind of coming back to that at some stage. I think that that's an interesting area, particularly to look at how those projects or how organizations and governments sort of interact with communities to make decisions around them. So like I said, I think that it's a different scale of project, but I think it's nonetheless quite interesting to potentially look at. So
definitely. Oh, we've got one in the chat. Thanks, Jim. The question is, what would be a current project somewhere in the world which you would like to be working on?
I'm doing a lot of that now, I'd say. So I think there's a number of different projects that I'm looking at kind of on the research side. So, just kind of touching and expanding maybe a bit on some of what I had talked about. So as I mentioned, a large project that we're working on now at the moment is looking at climate change adaptation. And specifically, that project is focused in the Philippines and Indonesia, and looking at how to support communities, particularly lower income communities in those contexts, in their adaptation strategies. And so climate change is going to have a significant and a larger impact, particularly in those countries compared to most in the world. And so we're really looking at sort of two different case studies in there to try to understand and look at how flood risk is changing. And so how is climate change impacting flooding? So that's kind of one big project that I'm working on at the moment. Some other work that I'm doing on the housing side is looking at a little bit more broadly, but so what really are the barriers to transitioning from emergency response? So how organizations respond after a crisis, really into supporting communities in a much longer term. So even if we look at examples here from New South Wales, examples of this would be the floods from 2 years ago, is really thinking about, well, how do we transition from sort of that initial assistance and recognize that those communities and those households, they still often need resources and support for multiple years. And so that recovery process, we often don't hear about that because, the media packs up and, those floods are gone and we're on to the next story. But that recovery process often takes up to 10 years. And so I'd say in every disaster that I've worked on and every community that I've looked at that's been affected by a disaster, that process almost universally takes at least 10 years. And so I think that's a long time frame. But so how can we better enable and support those communities to transition from that initial phase where there's often a mobilization of a lot of resources into a much longer term process? And so that's quite global in terms of the work that we're doing for that. So not just here in Australia, but other examples of that. We're interviewing and looking at people from Northwest Syria. So if anyone's been following in the news of the recent earthquake there, so obviously that's compounding almost a decade of civil war and conflict. So we're really looking at sort of what are the barriers to helping organizations transition from that early stage into enabling communities to recover in a much longer period of time. So those are kind of the main ones at the moment, I would say. And then sort of linked into that, we're also doing a little bit of work that's looking at climate change. And I'd say that this is a much further view out. So I guess to Grace's question, maybe what are the projects that I want to be working on in the coming years? We're starting to do a lot that's looking at how people are potentially going to need to move as a result of climate change. And really, what's that going to mean for how we plan our infrastructure? So, currently we're thinking in some areas, for example, we're building infrastructure that very well in the next 50 years could be inundated due to sea level rise. It could become uninhabitable due to heat waves. And so we need to think seriously and look at modeling that movement and migration process and thinking about that as more than people at some stage just make the jump. And so understanding the dynamics behind that to really enable us to think a little bit more deeply about how do we plan for infrastructure in a better way in the next 50 to 100 years for climate change impacts. So those are, I guess, is a broad answer. There's lots of different things that I'm working on probably beyond that list, but those are kind of the big ones I would say kind of at the moment. So hopefully that answers the question, Jim. Great one.
Thanks so much, Jim, for the question. And thank you, Aaron. I think we have another question in the chat, which is great. It reads, apart from the research field, are there other ways to get involved in humanitarian engineering through the workplace? For example, different companies that you could be involved with?
Yeah, so that's a great question, you. So I'd say absolutely yes. And so a couple different ways in terms of getting some training also. So I'll just kind of throw a name drop, our humanitarian engineering class. So Civil 3310, that's a great opportunity to kind of get your feet wet and test out the waters and hear what this is all about. So that's offered in semester 1. So you kind of missed this opportunity, but I encourage you to look at that for next year. But I'd say with organizations increasingly in different ways, and I'd say over your career, you certainly find yourself in a position where you're asked to contribute pro bono to volunteer on something. And so whether that's an overseas project or something that's here domestically, I think organizations are often quite active in the corporate social responsibility programs. So that's something I'd say, even if you're not doing this on a daily basis, kind of like the work I was talking about today, I think it's important that you at least make yourself aware about how to better engage with marginalized or low-income communities. So again, doing that background research, learning a little bit about how I think about that cultural aspect of who I'm talking to or engaging with, that can go a long ways, particularly when we're trying to work on those pro bono projects. So there's also organizations that have entire teams set up for this. So like examples of some that we're partnered with here at the university at the moment. And I'd encourage you all to actually take a look at this if you're interested in more of these opportunities and hearing about some of the work that engineering firms are doing through our Humanitarian Engineering Hub. And so that's through the Warren Center that's based in the Faculty of Engineering. So we actually run monthly webinars where you can hear from practitioners of kind of the work that they're doing and connect with on that. So, but there's a number of them. So GHD is an example, ARIP. There's really a lot of organizations are recognizing that those, the international market behind it, there's a business case also to this type of work. So the Australian government, we do a lot that funds this. There's a lot that comes from international funding for these types of programs to support in lower middle income country contexts. So there's definitely opportunities, I'd say, on the career side, if this is something that you're interested in. And I'd encourage you to take up some of the opportunities that we have here at the university to learn a little bit more about that, if that's something that you just want to try out, or if it's something that you are kind of interested in maybe going down that pathway.
I definitely couldn't recommend taking that subject more. It's a great opportunity to learn about all things humanitarian engineering and gives a different perspective as opposed to the other subjects, which are often quite content heavy. So it's a cool way to be creative in your engineering practice as well. Alex has come up with another question, which is great. He asks, where do you see your industry heading in 2050? Could advancements in technology change the way that you work or the problems that you face?
So definitely, I think that there's a lot of examples like this. I think that the biggest one, and this is something probably in international development that we talk a lot about, is that we're really trying to work ourselves out of a job. And so if communities can get to the stage where they can do this work themselves, and they don't need international support or resources, that's mission accomplished. That's a great outcome that we would like to see. And so I think increasingly what we're seeing is this type of work, and globally, it's really moving towards local involvement by engineers, by technical staff. So even a lot of the work that I've done since I started 10 plus years ago, it's really shifted more to remotely managing projects. So COVID has certainly exacerbated this, similar to other industries, but really allowing the local leadership in projects and implementing both on the research side as well as in practice, I would say, in looking at this type of work. So it's causing us to really think about, what is our role as engineers if we're working internationally? And it's not to say that that role will disappear anytime soon. Like I said, there's no shortage of problems globally around this. But I'd say that it often is, instead of doing a lot of the design work, it's often building those technical capacities. And so kind of going back to one of the points that I had, thinking about what fieldwork offers or some of the lessons that might come out of that, it's recognizing that it's building the capacities of other people often then to do the work. And that's often much more scalable when we look at trying to work internationally, I would say. So that's one of the big shifts, I'd say, in the next 50 years. And then obviously climate change, I think, is just going to continue to exacerbate. So a lot of my work is looking at that. But if we look at crises, and if anyone pays attention to the news, there's no shortage of disasters that are popping up, and that's certainly on the rise. And so I think, the way in which we respond to those and can cope with that change is going to require significant advancements. So technology is obviously one way to do that, but there's certainly other ones, I would say, that how we work is certainly changing.
Awesome. Any more questions? We probably have time for one or two more. If anyone wants to send them in.
Actually in the chat, Grace. So
sorry,
I think there was one more in the chat from Jared.
Oh, there was one more.
Yeah.
Oh, from Jared.
Yeah.
As someone who's very indecisive about my career direction, I was wondering whether you have any regrets pursuing this path of engineering.
So absolutely not. I think it's been exciting every day that I've pursued it. When I started out, I probably didn't know what I wanted to do. And so how I ended up in academia was sort of even a last minute decision. I think in a lot of respects, I've sort of just taken the opportunities that have come to me. And so I'd say, don't be afraid to make changes in your career. So pursue what you're passionate with at the moment and try it. So like, you're never going to know if you like a particular branch of engineering or a type until you actually go out and do some of that work. And so particularly early in your career, take opportunities to jump around. And so I think you can see sort of from my career experience, there's a wide range of different, aspects of engineering that I've worked on. And I think that has given me perspective about what I actually want to be doing. And so I think don't pigeonhole yourself into just one area. So mobility, I'd say, within the sector, particularly early in your career, is something that I encourage you to think about trying to utilize.
Definitely. And another question's just come up from Justin. In terms of climate change and disasters, what is Australia most at risk of, and what is being done to mitigate those risks?
It's a great question, Justin. On this front, I think that there's a lot that's obviously happening now. And so it probably depends on where you're at. So if we think about communities that are in Western Australia as compared to New South Wales, obviously the hazards that they're facing might be quite different. So for some communities in Central Australia, that might be heat. And so some of the Aboriginal communities that we've been working with there for different research projects, that's the biggest one. So drought, heat, heat waves. Those are definitely stark risks as a result of climate change. In different areas that might be flooding, and obviously that's not necessarily consistent. So, in 1 year, a community might be exposed to a devastating flood, and in the next year, a drought. So I think that the nature of those hazards under climate change is just becoming much more dynamic. So we're seeing that communities are being faced with hazards that they haven't experienced before, and they may not be, able to cope or prepared to deal with those. So there's, a number of efforts I'd say that are underway to try to improve that. So some of it is actually at a government level in terms of restructuring. So if anyone's been following or encouraged, if you're interested in this area, to look at sort of the reshuffle around that. So looking at the National Reconstruction Authority, looking at Resilience New South Wales, our state agency, and sort of how they've evolved in the last couple of years, particularly in the aftermath of the floods. So there's some interesting sort of government reports if anyone's interested in kind of just skimming the abstract. Again, you don't need to read all of them to see kind of what's been happening on that front. But I think there's also other ways, and on the research side, there's things here we're doing at the university as well to better support that process. So another example of some research that we're involved in is looking at the intersection. So Justin, your question was, well, which hazards, is sort of the top one. Some of the work that we're doing is actually looking at, well, how do we consider those together? So if we look at one community, how do we weigh up, for example, the risk of bushfire versus floods? And so what is increasingly coming out, I'd say, is more sophisticated tools to track that, look at, assisting communities, that really assist the planning process. But there's also a lot of technology that's helping in that process. So we're seeing a lot of that sort of come into that to make that easier also to do.
Awesome. Do you have any other questions? Otherwise, I'm sure we could wrap it up here. Thank you so much to everyone who sent in questions as well. It's great to have a discussion after hearing a great kind of investigation into Aaron's career and the lessons that he's learnt along the way throughout his career as well. So if anybody has any last minute questions, otherwise we'll close the session off. Thank you again to Aaron for sharing so much of your experience with us today. And I really encourage anyone who is interested in humanitarian engineering to investigate further into Aaron's work and the classes that he teaches. He's an excellent lecturer and supervisor for thesis. So couldn't recommend working with Aaron more. Thank you so much again for your time. And thank you for everyone for joining as well. So I think we can close off the session.